On a cool evening in Las Vegas, Nevada, the luxury SUV was parked eerily still on a quiet street. The faint hum of city lights from the Strip was the only sound that filled the air. Inside, Chanel Boyd, a beloved gospel singer and social media influencer, lay lifeless, a single gunshot wound taking her life. To the world, she was a beacon of faith, preaching wealth, success, and the power of belief to millions of followers. She was the epitome of a modern-day gospel preacher, blending faith with affluence, preaching about prosperity, while showcasing her own luxurious lifestyle. But on that night, her life came to an abrupt, violent end. The discovery of Chanel Boyd's body sent shockwaves through the community. What seemed like a random act of violence soon evolved into something far more sinister. Investigators were drawn into a web of lies, money, and manipulation. The more they dug, the more they uncovered a fraudulent charity that used the guise of faith to siphon millions from the unsuspecting public. And at the center of it all was Chanel Boyd herself. Her death, it seemed, was not a random tragedy, but a key that unlocked a dark world of deceit. Chanel's meteoric rise had been fueled by promises of wealth and salvation, her influence a bridge between the faith-based community and the secular world of wealth and power. But as authorities started to connect the dots, they found that Chanel's death was inextricably linked to one of the largest religious scams in Nevada's history. Was Chanel an innocent victim of a twisted scheme? Or was she complicit in the very fraud that led to her untimely demise? The answers lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. Chanel Boyd was more than just a gospel singer. She was a force of nature in the world of social media and faith-based influence. A woman of conviction and charisma, Chanel amassed millions of followers across various platforms. Her brand was simple yet compelling: faith, wealth, and prosperity. She preached that anyone could achieve greatness through belief, hard work, and divine favor. She portrayed herself as a living testament to the rewards of faith, showcasing her lavish lifestyle, designer clothes, luxury cars, private jets, alongside inspirational messages of hope and spiritual fulfillment. Born in humble circumstances, Chanel's rise to prominence was swift, fueled by her raw talent, her magnetic presence, and a message that resonated deeply with her growing audience. She had built a personal empire, blending her faith with financial success. Her gospel music reached millions. Her social media posts inspired thousands to claim their blessings, and her seminars promised wealth through divine intervention. It wasn't just about music, it was a lifestyle, a philosophy that blended the sacred and the material in a way that captivated both believers and skeptics alike. As Chanel's influence grew, so did her connections. She aligned herself with well-known pastors, influencers, and promoters, all operating in a network that blurred the lines between faith and commerce. She encouraged donations to her ministry, preaching that contributions to her cause would lead to divine rewards. But there were cracks beneath the surface. The donations, while seemingly going toward charitable works, were funneled through questionable channels. A fraud was taking root, and Chanel's charity became a tool for something far darker. Her death as tragic as it was, didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a series of events involving powerful figures in the faith-based community, individuals who had their own hidden agendas. Chanel's image, once a beacon of hope, would soon be overshadowed by the dark revelations surrounding her charity's operations. This case goes beyond just one woman's tragic end. It uncovers a web of deception that has reached deep into the foundations of Nevada's religious and philanthropic communities. What was Chanel Boyd's role in this massive fraud, and how far did her influence stretch? To find out more about the truth behind Chanel's death, the scandal it exposed, and the layers of betrayal that followed, make sure to subscribe to Beyond the Evidence. Join us as we unravel the threads of this complex case, shedding light on the hidden world of influencers, faith, and financial manipulation. You won't want to miss what comes next. Chanel Boyd's success story was not one she built alone. Behind her rise to fame were key figures, both allies and collaborators, whose actions would come under scrutiny after her death. These individuals were part of a web of relationships that intersected at the crossroads of faith, fame, and fortune. Understanding these dynamics is crucial to unraveling the mystery of Chanel's involvement in the fraudulent charity and, ultimately, her untimely demise. At the center of this network was Chanel's close association with prominent pastors, many of whom shared similar ideologies of wealth and divine favor. These men, whose churches were highly influential in the faith-based community, had long preached about prosperity, positioning themselves as intermediaries between their congregants and divine blessings. Their sermons echoed a philosophy of financial abundance, claiming that donations were a pathway to spiritual elevation. Chanel, with her massive following, was a natural fit for this community. She appeared alongside them at events, lending her star power to their causes and promoting the idea that spiritual growth and material wealth could coexist harmoniously. But these relationships were not purely spiritual. They were, in many ways, financial partnerships, mutually beneficial alliances that allowed each party to amplify their influence. The pastors provided Chanel with a platform to reach more followers, while Chanel's influence brought a new generation of donors to their ministries. The lines between charity and business blurred as money flowed freely between their ministries, all under the guise of faith-based work. However, not all relationships were built on trust or faith. Chanel's interactions with some of the promoters and influencers in her circle were more transactional. Many of these individuals had little interest in the gospel message, and their ties to Chanel were rooted in self-interest and the pursuit of wealth. Promoters who organized Chanel's events, managed her brand, and negotiated sponsorships were often seen as mere facilitators of the broader scam. They helped funnel money through the charity, using Chanel's popularity to legitimize the flow of cash. Chanel herself, while the public face of this movement, may have been unaware of the full scope of the deception taking place behind the scenes, or so it seemed. As the investigation into her death progressed, it became evident that some of these relationships were not as transparent as they appeared. Trust was a currency in this world, and it was clear that certain individuals had taken advantage of Chanel's trust for their own gain. There were whispers about the people closest to her. Was she too trusting, too naive, to see the manipulation happening under her nose? Or was she complicit in the scheme, fully aware of how the money was being funneled through her charity? The investigation would soon reveal that some of her closest allies had their own motives, ones that did not align with Chanel's public persona. One key figure in this web was Chanel's manager, a person whose role seemed to straddle the line between professional support and personal gain. His connections to the promoters who organized her events were extensive, and he had been a part of the team that handled the logistics of Chanel's charity work. However, as the financial discrepancies began to surface, the question arose, was he merely a facilitator, or had he played an active role in orchestrating the fraudulent activities? His potential involvement in the scam added another layer of complexity to the case. But the most troubling relationship of all was Chanel's own complicity, or potential lack thereof, in the operations. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, investigators were left grappling with a haunting question. Did Chanel unknowingly walk into a trap, blinded by the allure of fame and fortune, or was she an active participant in the exploitation of her followers? Her relationship with money, fame, and the power she wielded had undoubtedly played a role in shaping her decisions that, in the end, led to her tragic death. The complexity of these relationships became increasingly apparent as investigators began to peel back the layers of Chanel's life. Each individual involved, whether they were pastors, promoters, or influencers, played a part in the larger drama of deception, greed, and betrayal that ultimately led to the unraveling of Chanel Boyd's carefully crafted image. It began with a whisper, a quiet murmur that grew louder as more people began to ask the same questions. Chanel Boyd had built an empire on her message of prosperity, claiming that through faith, anyone could achieve wealth and success. But the allure of her extravagant lifestyle started to draw scrutiny. Her followers, many of whom had placed their trust in her, began to wonder, was there more to Chanel's ministry than met the eye? It wasn't long before the first doubt surfaced. A few online comments and social media posts questioned the legitimacy of her charity's operations. These early warning signs were easy to dismiss. After all, Chanel had millions of followers, many of whom praised her for her genuine messages of faith and giving. However, the criticism started to snowball, gaining traction among some of Chanel's more skeptical followers. They were no longer just questioning her wealth, they were questioning her motives. The perfect image of faith and success that Chanel had carefully cultivated was starting to crack. One of the first red flags came from an anonymous source who had attended one of Chanel's fundraising events. The source claimed that the majority of the money raised from ticket sales, donations, and merchandise didn't appear to reach the intended recipients. Instead, it seemed to disappear into a shadowy network of financial transactions that couldn't be traced. This information was passed on to investigative reporters, but it wasn't enough to spark a full-scale investigation just yet. Still, the seed of doubt had been planted, and others began digging into Chanel's operations. As the whispers grew, So did the questions surrounding the charity itself. What was the real purpose of Chanel's donations? Where was the money going? For many, these were uncomfortable questions. Chanel had cultivated an aura of sanctity around her work, positioning herself as a champion for the downtrodden and a spokesperson for the disadvantaged. But as the days passed, more troubling patterns began to emerge. Reports from former employees and volunteers revealed that the charity was poorly managed, with funds seemingly unaccounted for. Staff members who had once worked closely with Chanel found themselves unable to answer basic questions about the charity's financial records. Some reported being asked to sign non-disclosure agreements after leaving, preventing them from speaking out about the organization's inner workings. These incidents began to raise suspicions that something more sinister was happening behind the scenes, though they were not yet enough to draw concrete conclusions. At the same time, journalists began to investigate the patterns of donations made to Chanel's cause. It was discovered that the charity was heavily reliant on a network of anonymous donations, often in large sums, from wealthy benefactors who were also tied to other religious organizations with questionable practices. These donations were funneled through various accounts that were difficult to trace, raising serious concerns about transparency and accountability. Even more alarming were reports that some donors felt pressured to contribute more than they were comfortable with Chanel's persuasive rhetoric about divine reward acting as a motivator for larger gifts. But it wasn't just the financial discrepancies that were raising alarm bells. Several former associates of Chanel's, including close collaborators from her church and promotional teams, began to report strange behavior. One individual who had worked closely with Chanel for several years recalled a conversation in which Chanel expressed fears about being watched by higher powers within the faith-based community. Chanel, who had once been confident and outspoken, had started to appear increasingly anxious, as though she were in over her head. Her growing unease didn't go unnoticed by those who were closest to her. Meanwhile, some of her followers began to notice unsettling contradictions in Chanel's messages. While she continued to preach about the importance of giving and generosity, her personal social media posts began showcasing more of her extravagant purchases, luxury cars, designer clothing, and expensive vacations. Some viewers felt that these messages didn't align with the values she espoused, and that the pursuit of wealth, rather than spiritual fulfillment, had become the true focus of her platform. The turning point came when a whistleblower within Chanel's inner circle approached a local reporter with evidence of the charity's fraudulent activities. According to the whistleblower, large sums of money were being moved between accounts connected to Chanel's charity, with no clear explanation for their destination. What was supposed to be a simple philanthropic effort had turned into something far more complex and perhaps criminal. This revelation sparked the first serious investigation into Chanel's operations, and the pieces began to fall into place. As suspicions mounted, the pressure on Chanel intensified. She found herself being scrutinized by both the media and law enforcement. The questions surrounding her charity's financial practices became impossible to ignore, and what was once a high-profile success story now seemed on the brink of unraveling. Chanel had built her empire on the idea that wealth was a divine blessing, but the questions surrounding the legitimacy of her own wealth threatened to expose her as something far different. Though Chanel tried to maintain her image as a woman of faith, the cracks in her carefully constructed world were now wide enough for everyone to see. The people who had supported her and trusted her began to ask themselves if they had been manipulated. But before they could find any answers, before the truth about the charity could be fully exposed, Chanel Boyd was found dead in her SUV. As the investigation into Chanel Boyd's charity intensified, the situation surrounding her life and death grew increasingly complex. What had once appeared to be a charitable organization with the goal of improving the lives of the underprivileged began to take on the appearance of a massive financial operation, one designed to exploit both faith and the goodwill of her followers. The pieces of a much larger puzzle started to come into focus, and with each new revelation, the scope of the fraud became more apparent. Chanel's charity, it seemed, was nothing more than a front. A significant portion of the funds raised through donations was never directed toward the supposed charitable causes, but instead funneled into the pockets of individuals within Chanel's inner circle. Promoters and pastors tied to Chanel's network had used her platform to solicit donations, all while skimming off the top and diverting funds for personal gain. The web of financial mismanagement and fraudulent transactions stretched across multiple accounts and institutions, each layer hiding more of the truth than it revealed. As the charity's financial records were examined, investigators discovered that Chanel herself had been heavily involved in some of these transactions. While it wasn't clear whether she was fully aware of the extent of the fraud, it was undeniable that she had signed off on large sums of money being transferred through the organization's accounts. The charity, which claimed to support education and health initiatives for marginalized communities, had instead become a vehicle for money laundering, funneling large donations through. The news of Chanel Boyd's death struck like a lightning bolt, sending shockwaves through her millions of followers, her family, and the broader religious community. At first, the reports were fragmented, and many believed it was just another tragic case of violence in an unforgiving city. But as the details began to unfold, a chilling truth emerged. Chanel had been shot inside her luxury SUV, and her death was connected to the very empire she had built. In the immediate aftermath, emotions ran high. Her supporters, who had once seen her as a beacon of faith and prosperity, were left reeling. For many, Chanel was not just a gospel singer and influencer. She was an icon, a figure they looked up to as a symbol of divine favor and success. To them, the idea that she could have been involved in anything less than virtuous was unimaginable. Her death, combined with the unfolding scandal, shattered the carefully constructed image of the woman who had once preached faith and wealth in equal measure. The public reaction was mixed, with some choosing to mourn her passing, while others began to ask more difficult questions. Was Chanel truly an innocent victim, or was she complicit in the fraud that had now come to light? While many of her followers refused to believe that their faith leader could be involved in such a scandal, the truth about the fraudulent charity began to surface, and with it, the complexity of Chanel's involvement in the financial deception. At the same time, the reactions from those closest to Chanel were telling. Family members and longtime friends expressed grief and disbelief, struggling to comprehend how the woman they had known could be caught in such a web of corruption. Some relatives pointed to the pressure Chanel had faced in maintaining her public persona and questioned whether the expectations placed on her had contributed to her downfall. Others, however, couldn't help but wonder if Chanel had been fully aware of the activities happening within her own ministry, even as she presented herself as a model of piety and prosperity. Meanwhile, within the religious and influencer communities, the reactions were more cautious. Some of Chanel's fellow pastors and influencers publicly distanced themselves from a scandal, unwilling to tarnish their own reputations by association. While some expressed sorrow over her death, others quietly began to sever ties, aware of the potential fallout. The leaders of Chanel's former network became defensive as more questions about the charity's practices arose, many attempting to downplay their own involvement. The case quickly became a media frenzy, with news outlets eager to connect the dots between Chanel's death, the fraudulent charity, and the powerful figures implicated in the scheme. The investigation into Chanel's death turned from a simple homicide case into something much darker, a key that could potentially unlock a massive scandal involving some of the most influential figures in Nevada's religious and philanthropic circles. As the investigation into Chanel Boyd's death intensified, the layers of deceit surrounding her and the charity she had built began to unravel in shocking detail. Initially, Chanel's death seemed like just another tragic case in a city often associated with violence and corruption. But as authorities dug deeper, they discovered a web of fraud and manipulation far beyond what they had anticipated. Chanel's involvement in the charity and the secrets hidden within it was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. The first breakthrough in the case came when investigators were able to trace large sums of money that had passed through Chanel's charity accounts. These funds, which were initially intended for various causes like education, healthcare, and community development, had been funneled into a network of offshore accounts and shell corporations. This network was linked to some of the most powerful figures in Nevada's faith-based and business communities, individuals who had used Chanel's platform to solicit donations under false pretenses. The more investigators uncovered, the more it became clear that Chanel's charity was being used as a front for money laundering and financial exploitation. Key figures within Chanel's network, including prominent pastors and high-profile influencers, had siphoned off funds that were meant for the public good. These funds were not only being misused, but in some cases, they were diverted into luxury real estate, expensive cars, and other forms of personal enrichment. It became evident that Chanel, though publicly presenting herself as a beacon of hope and prosperity, had been complicit in a scheme that exploited her followers' goodwill. While the investigation focused on Chanel's financial dealings, it was clear that her personal involvement in the scandal was more complex. Some investigators suggested that Chanel might have been a victim of manipulation, unaware of the full extent of the fraudulent activities happening within her charity. Others, however, began to wonder whether Chanel had knowingly participated in the scheme, driven by greed or a desire to maintain her lifestyle and status. The truth, it seemed, was not as simple as it appeared. Evidence surfaced, suggesting that Chanel had been under increasing pressure in the months leading up to her death. Financial strain, mounting public scrutiny, and possible threats from individuals within her circle seemed to have taken a toll on her mental health. Investigators found that she had made attempts to distance herself from certain individuals, perhaps sensing the growing danger. It was clear that Chanel had been operating in a world where loyalty was fleeting and trust was a rare commodity. As the investigation unfolded, the authorities turned their attention to Chanel's inner circle. Key players in her charity, including her manager and several promoters, were brought in for questioning. These individuals, many of whom had facilitated the fraudulent activities, were arrested on charges of money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy. But the deeper the investigators dug, the more questions arose about who truly orchestrated the fraud, and whether Chanel's death was the result of a calculated attempt to silence her before she could expose the full scope of the scandal. What investigators uncovered next was even more startling. Evidence suggested that Chanel's death may have been far from random. Several individuals who had been involved in the fraudulent scheme were known to have made veiled threats against her in the months before her murder. Some were desperate to maintain the facade of legitimacy, fearing that Chanel might reveal the truth. Others saw her as a liability, someone whose knowledge of the scheme could bring the entire operation crashing down. Forensic evidence from the crime scene pointed to a planned execution, rather than a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. The shooter appeared to have known exactly where Chanel would be and when, suggesting that her death had been carefully orchestrated. This revelation only added more complexity to the investigation, as authorities began to connect Chanel's death to the larger web of deceit and corruption that had been exposed. Chanel's murder, it seemed, was not just an isolated tragedy. It was a key that unlocked a deeper investigation into one of Nevada's most elaborate and dangerous financial scams, with ripples that reached far beyond the world of faith-based fundraising. As new revelations came to light, the public became increasingly captivated by the case. Who was truly behind Chanel Boyd's death, and what role did she play in the criminal operation that ultimately led to her demise? Was she a victim of her own success, or was she complicit in the fraud that took so many innocent people's money? The story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning.